Okay, let's connect with Mr. Adi Godrej now, Chairman of the Godrej Group. Mr. Godrej, good morning and thank you for joining us. I'm going to start off this discussion with a very basic question. Everyone on the street is of the opinion that Indian economy has healed, inflation, the threat is over, IIP has stopped contracting, and we could be staring at much better days ahead.
Yes, I think so. I think the worst is behind us, and especially if we get a growth-oriented government in the national elections, I think things can move forward rapidly. And I think the GDP growth in 14-15 and 15-16 could be much higher than in the previous 2 years.
Mr. Godrej, for someone who has seen many cycles, many election verdicts, understands the power of democracy, what do you think would be the importance of this year's election? Because everyone is of the view that this year's election outcome could be a make or break event for India.
Well, yes, I think it will be a very important event, especially because over the last 2 financial years, our growth rate has decelerated very considerably. It's well below India's potential. So a growth-oriented government could see to it that we are back on the 8% plus growth path.
Mr. Godrej, what is the sense that you're getting about as to how a stable government at the top is going to be key to you at the Godrej Group?
Well, I think although our group has done reasonably well despite the slowdown, if the economy picks up, it will certainly help our group too. And it is very important for the country. If we are to provide jobs, if we are to overcome poverty, I think a growth rate of 8% plus is extremely important. And it is a shame that we have landed up with growth rates at 5% or lower in the last 2 financial years.
Can we go back to 8% is the big question, sir, because for the moment, if you talk about 8%, it looks like a mirage.
No, not at all. I think a good government can bring about 8% growth very quickly. For example, if you pass the goods and services tax law, it will add 2 percentage points, other things being equal to the growth rate. There are many other steps we could take to improve the perception of the country. Investments would come up. For example, the tax people have gone about irrationally, especially with foreign investors. We have created a mess with the Vodafone case after the Supreme Court had set back the government's tax decision on it. I think many such changes could add tremendously to the growth rate of India. So it's not just a mirage. India could be growing at 8 to 10%.
Mr. Godrej, I don't know whether it's going to come true or not, but recently we have the Farm Minister, send out a warning saying that monsoon this year may not be as great and we could have a below average normal monsoon. Do you think that, the GDP forecast that we've been working with is going to significantly get challenged if this prediction were to be coming true?
It's difficult to say about the monsoon. It's a bit too early. Yes, there are some signals both in global meteorological predictions and some of the Indian predictions that the monsoon may not be very good, especially because there's an El Nino possibility. But I think even if the monsoon is not good, our growth rates could be quite good. Remember, in the past, even when monsoons have not been good, we have grown at 8% plus. So it's a question of our policy decisions, our decisions regarding sentiment and perception. That's very important.
Mr. Godrej, my next question, and I'm not trying to put any words in your mouth, I just want to understand the connect between welfare schemes and rural spending, because the view on the street is that the reason why rural India is consuming more is because the current government is really following schemes like Narega and food security. Do you think the new government should follow these welfare schemes?
No, I don't think that is the only reason for rural prosperity. I think good agricultural prices, reasonably good agricultural production, especially this year the monsoon has been good, agricultural production has been good, are also responsible. I think the government schemes only add on to that rural prosperity. I think it's very important for us to create rural prosperity because there's tremendous poverty in the rural areas of the country, and if you look at the last 15 years, the discretionary spending increase in rural India has been almost at 20%, because if you look at their incomes after keeping body and soul together, they've been rising quite high, and they spend it on consumer products, which helps the economy generally. So I think we should use other means to keep the fiscal deficit under control. High fiscal deficit is also bad for our macroeconomic situation. High current account deficit is bad. Fortunately, this government has already contained both, and I think it will form a good base for whoever forms the next government to see that it can be growth oriented.
So, Mr. Godrej, as a representative of India Inc., what is it that India Inc. really wants from the new government, assuming that it's a pro-growth one that comes to power?
Well, I think good policy decisions, bring less government and more governance into play, improve the ease of doing business in India, bring in some crucial legislation. I think the most important legislation, as I mentioned, for quick growth is the GST. There are other important legislations, and create a good perception about the Indian economy, especially among international investors and also among Indian investors. We should try and ensure that ease of doing business in India improves. We've not been very good in terms of ease of doing business in the past, and over the last 2 or 3 years it has further deteriorated. We should quickly improve the ease of doing business in our country.
But as a representative of India Inc., are you in favor of welfare schemes? Are you in favor of subsidized LPG cylinders, fuel prices?
Well, it depends on how that is done. If there is some subsidies in certain spheres for the very poor, that makes sense. If it's a general subsidy, if you give a subsidy to 60-70% of the population, or in some cases like low diesel prices to all the population, that is not good. The big problem with subsidies is that the consumption of subsidized product gets misused, and a lot of the subsidy doesn't pass to the people who deserve those subsidies. I'm not totally against subsidies, but well-directed subsidies, especially with the Aadhaar card program, could be useful for the country.
Mr. Godrej, how imperative it is for the RBI to actually ease its interest rate cycle for, some bit of sentiment pickup, demand pickup to be coming in on ground?
I think it's important for a country to have a reasonable interest rate regime, because high interest rate regime clearly works negatively in two spheres. One is investment becomes slow because the cost of borrowing for investment is very high. Secondly, consumption of many items which are financed, such as autos, residential housing, etc., also suffers badly. So a low interest regime is important, but for that we need to control inflation too, and we have allowed inflation to get to unreasonable levels, mainly because we've allowed the rupee to depreciate well beyond what it should have, and that creates a vicious cycle, because the rupee depreciation leads to inflation, and then inflation leads to rupee depreciation. So I think we need to get the right policies in place so that we have regime in which the rupee doesn't depreciate too much and inflation is controlled. I think we should have a policy where inflation is controlled below 5%. Already the WPI is around that level, and if we can bring the CPI down, which I think will come down because vegetable and fruit prices have started declining, and global commodity prices I expect will now also start declining because the Chinese economy is not doing too well. Their demand will come down. Overall, I expect in 6 months' time a reasonable control on inflation and therefore on interest rates.
Mr. Godrej, it's so good to have you on ET. Now, really appreciate your valuable time. That was the chairman of Godrej Group, Mr. Adi Godrej, outlining his thoughts that he believes that the worst for Indian economy is behind us. But let's go to Gujarat.